Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Bilingue, conversations with moms and experts on how we're actually raising bilingual children in real life. Today, we're doing something we haven't done before, and I'm really excited. We're focusing on Spanish specifically, because if you're raising a Spanish speaking child like I am, you know that the questions can get very specific very fast. Like, for example, why can she roll her R's? Is that normal? When does that happen? So today's guest, Nichole Carrasquillo, is a bilingual speech-language pathologist, Latina mom, raising her own daughter bilingual as well, and author. Nichole, welcome. I'm so excited to have the conversation. You're a Latina mom, a bilingual speech-language pathologist with over a decade of clinical experience, and also an author. So let's start at the beginning. What was your own language journey growing up? And then how has that affected the kind of clinician that you are today?
Thank you for having me before. Antes que todo, thank you so much for the invite. I'm so excited to be here. So my journey. So I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee in the 80s to Puerto Rican parents. They
Mm.
had only been in the States for a few years, 2 or 3 years, before they had me. And I'm so lucky, I'm so blessed that they really prioritized having me grow up in the culture. We were Spanish only in the home.
Mm.
We spoke Spanish. We ate arroz con habichuela, mofongo, all the Puerto Rican foods, listened to yes. And so even though we were surrounded by only English. It was very, in that day and age, like there was no Spanish TV, no access really to Spanish books. So my
Mm.
mom would have my grandma send books from Puerto Rico. So she would have Spanish books to read to us. So they really did such an amazing job just, just making sure that me and my brother grew up with Spanish at the forefront in our culture, proud of our culture. So we grew up there, and then by age 7, we moved back to Puerto Rico because my parents were there by themselves. They were the only ones, all the family was in Puerto Rico, and it's hard. It's hard now. I know it myself. Raising a family far from your own family is difficult. So they ended up moving to Puerto Rico. So I grew up there. I went to school there. I did my bachelor's and my master's degree in Puerto Rico. And over there, like I'm so grateful that my mom taught me how to read in Spanish while we were in the States because that came in very in handy when we moved back to Puerto Rico and schooling was in Spanish. So
Mm.
that was just a great
Yeah.
experience, just growing up between two worlds. Because I kind of I didn't feel fully from the States when I was here. And then in Puerto Rico, it's like, well, but you weren't born here, so you're not really Puerto Rican, like I grew up like in those two worlds, like being part of both, but none at the same time. It was just a very interesting experience. And after my master's degree, I decided to find a job out in the States and ended up in the Chicago area. And over here, I met my husband, who's half German, half Czech, grew up here his whole life. And now we're raising two bilingual kids. I have an almost 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. And yeah, so now we're raising a multilingual family. There's German too. My father-in-law speaks German to the kids. I only speak Spanish to the kids. My husband does English, so we're doing one parent, one language. And
Mm.
so yeah, it's a very fun, multicultural, multilingual home, and that this whole experience, obviously, I bring into my clinical, my job, which I just
Right.
love. Just having that lived experience, I think, makes a huge difference in connecting with the parents and the families I serve. Because I know I've lived it, and it's not just the clinical knowledge. Oh, yes, I went to school. I have the textbook knowledge of development, bilingual language development, but I lived it too. And I think that makes it just an amazing connecting point with families of, I am part of your culture too. And that helps a lot with building those relationships.
Yeah, that's I could totally relate. I grew up in Colombia for me it was the opposite. I was born here and then I moved to Colombia. I was there until I was 11 and then I came back. So my childhood was
Mm.
there and then I moved here and I had to learn English. And when I was in
Uh,
Colombia, I mean, now that I go back, I'm too American, but I'm here and I feel, I'm Colombian. And then I want to
yes,
make sure my
yes, yeah.
daughter also did that. So it's the whole like growing up between two worlds is I can totally understand it.
Yeah.
So I have a question. I want to get into your clinical practice and
Hmm.
get into the nitty-gritty, starting with like the most important question, I think. What is the difference between a bilingual speech-language pathologist and someone who is not a bilingual speech-language pathologist? Just a speech-language pathologist.
Yeah. So we have the same preparation. Typically, we need a bachelor's degree, not necessarily in communication sciences. Some people do their bachelor's in different areas. We all need a master's degree in speech language pathology, so that is equal. Some of us go to a specialized program that has more of an emphasis on bilingualism, bilingual language development. So that was since I went to school in Puerto Rico, we very much had all of the Spanish information, like what is typical, what is atypical in Spanish language development. So a speech pathologist who goes to university in the States, most do not have that information. So that is a difference. You have to be bilingual, not necessarily native speaker, but have a almost native or near native proficiency in the second language. There's a lot of extra training that goes into it. Even for myself, I went to school in Puerto Rico. I had the experience of knowing, being a speech pathologist in two languages. It's not just like having basic proficiency and knowledge in the language, but having all those like that technical information. I had that. And even when I moved here, I felt like I didn't have enough. When it came to assessments and what is appropriate, are standard scores appropriate, dynamic, there's so much more like nuance to it that I've done countless hours of continuing education in bilingual assessments. So there's a lot that goes into it. Some states have an extra certification. New York is one of them, where you get certified to be a bilingual speech language pathologist. In Illinois, we don't have that. So it's basically ASHA, our American Speech and Hearing Association, has kind of a checkbox that you can have to mark yourself as multilingual. But there's just a lot of extra training that goes into it to be a bilingual speech pathologist.
But when they say bilingual, does that mean it's not necessarily Spanish, right? What does it actually mean when they say bilingual? I know that obviously it requires more training, but does it mean that you are able to understand language development in more than one language, or is it in specific languages? What should parents be looking for? They're specifically raising kids in Spanish and in English, want to work with a speech language pathologist.
Yeah, so best case scenario in a perfect world, you find someone who is bilingual in your language. So you can be bilingual in Arabic, you can be bilingual in Polish.
Right.
And so typically when you're trying to find a clinician, you'll find bilingual in Spanish, like Spanish English. We do have the knowledge, like if I were to assess, like in the school system, we can't pick and choose, like, oh, I'm going to assess you or not you. So we try to find, outsource and find a bilingual speech pathologist in the same language as the child. But if it's a very low incidence language where you can't find someone, a qualified bilingual speech pathologist does have the tools to be able to assess, even if they don't know that language. But best practice would be to find someone who matches the language, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So speaking of that, so bilingual SLPs, but I think especially Latina SLPs are still rare. What does it actually mean for a Spanish-speaking family to find someone who understands their child's not only linguistic, but also cultural context?
Yes, yes. I feel like that's huge, and it's a huge blessing for me to be able to be part of that. It really knowing not only the language but the culture really helps bridge the gap. Like I've experienced it in my practice where sometimes in Latino culture, we have a little bit more stigma when it comes to certain diagnoses or needing
Mm.
support, or if there's a delay, I've seen a lot of parents blame themselves. And
Mm.
so I understand that because I am part of the culture. I've seen this with my family members, you know, with my friends, and it really gives me that like empathy and that understanding of how I approach certain conversations, especially when we're talking in the school system. A child arrives in kindergarten and the school team notices that there are difficulties, but the parents maybe had not noticed because they didn't have the information or were afraid to ask for help. And so
Mm.
knowing the that cultural context, I come in from a different lens than maybe some of my coworkers who would come in with the data, and they would come in like, okay, so
Mm.
senora, you know, we've noticed these things, your son needs help. And then the parent just recoils and is like, you know, and they sometimes they'll get defensive and be like, no, 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 they're fine. And so that's where you know, I love it because I'll be like, hey, time out. And I'll speak to them in their language, which is already, you know, a connecting point. Everyone else is talking to the parent with through an interpreter. And I'll be like, okay, let's chat, let's talk. And so
Yeah.
knowing all of this, you know, I'll start with, this is not your fault. You know, you did nothing wrong. Like the
Mm.
fact that your son has a delay, you know, you did nothing wrong, and we're here to help. Like what do you want? And kind of like getting to that common ground of what are your goals? What do you want for your child? Like what is your goal for them to communicate? So that's where we can help. We can come in and we can help. And you know, just kind of making that connection. Knowing the cultural background to me has been amazing because there have been lots of conversations that I've been able to diffuse because I know where they're coming from, and I can make that connection and like help the rest of the team understand like this is where they were coming from. Like let's kind of go like ease into this. So it's a game changer in like establishing that relationship because it's a team. We are a team with the parent.
Yeah, that's so true. And on the flip side of that, when they do go to you, have you noticed any kind of common misconception about the language development in their children, specifically for Latin families, since that's who you work with?
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of misconceptions, the most I see, and it's sad that, you know, it's 2026 and we're still seeing this. There are parents who come to, and I mostly work school based, school age children. So they'll usually come in and they've already had an evaluation done, or they received services through early
Mm.
intervention. So they've already had some experience, or with a pediatrician, you know, they've had a conversation with a pediatrician, and they'll come in and they'll say, oh, we spoke Spanish at home, only Spanish at home until the speech therapist at this place, or until the pediatrician told us to stop speaking Spanish because we were going to confuse them, or because they had
Yeah.
already been
Yeah.
diagnosed with a speech delay, they said that they should pick a language so they don't mess up their development or their progress. Oh, because the progress is going to be faster if we stick to one language. And like that just makes me furious because it is not based in research at all. And sometimes it comes from a private practice who just does not have access to a bilingual speech pathologist, and they want to serve the child. So they say, "Oh, we can just work in English and it'll be fine. You know, it'll make things easier and quicker if we just work in English." And it's like, you know, it's a lie. And so that really just
Yeah.
breaks my heart that that's still a misconception. So you know, then that's a conversation that I have to have with the family of, no, you don't have to stop speaking your language. You know, I can give you some strategies of how to, you know, depending on what their goals are, you know, do you want to do both languages? That's totally okay. Or you can switch back to Spanish if that's what's best for your family, and it will not be detrimental to your child's language development. So that is tough. It is tough to deal with.
That's so sad. And parents, we just want to do what's best for our children, so we will take the advice and run with it. I'm glad that we're having this conversation so that we can spread the word that bilingualism does not cause delays. It's the one message that I keep hearing from all the experts. You have a superpower because you're there to kind of guide them and really provide clarity on maybe what's confusing and what's fearful for them. So when things shift and they go from worried to understanding what's really going on, what does that feel like based on what you've seen?
It's amazing. I mean, I love seeing that moment when it clicks. And sometimes it's at an evaluation meeting where we've had this whole conversation and we shift the blame, we erase that blame and that guilt that sometimes is there. And just them understanding, and that's part of like what I do is parent education. I am passionate about just in informal terms, in parent-friendly terms, helping parents understand what is typical, what is atypical, and how to help. That is huge because that at that point, me as the clinician, like I don't want to be the expert. Like, okay, I have the knowledge, but you are the expert on your child. And so my goal is to like, is that teamwork. I want the parent to understand, okay, your child has a delay in these areas. I want them to understand what that means thoroughly in ways that they can then be a part of the team, equals. Like, okay, you know what this means if there's a receptive language delay, let's say. And so that means that, let's focus on reading, let's focus on more input, so we become team members instead of just me being the expert from over here telling you things where like they truly understand and they can be an active participant in the team, in their child's development.
That's so true. At the end of the day, every child is different, and the parent is the expert on the child. No one else is going to know your child the way that you do as the mom or as the father. So that's amazing. And let's get into the development side of it, like specifically Spanish, because I think that you have a unique perspective on that. Given the fact that, you are bilingual in English and in Spanish, you're also raising your children bilingual. So I'm super excited to hear like what you do to do that. But before we get into the strategies that you're using yourself to raise them bilingual, can we get a little bit of guidance on Spanish? I know that in English, there's some sounds that babies will naturally develop faster because it's easier for them to pronounce. Is that the same in Spanish? Does the language develop the same way as it would in English? Or does the fact that they're two different languages make them develop differently?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that.